Welcome to the You Can Hack It workshop by Topstitch makers and Jerry and Stitches. Today's sewing hack of the essential shirts sewing pattern is a dyeing technique called stitched shibori, and we are focusing on creating a repeated elliptical pattern. Stitch shibori uses stitching in order to create the intricate geometric patterns for dyed fabric. It uses a series of running stitches as the foundation for tie dyeing. After stitching, the threads are pulled up to form creases and folds, then knots are made to bind these folds tightly together. This produces the resist pattern when the bound fabric is placed in a dye vat. The simple lines of the essential shirt is ideal for showcasing the beautiful patterns that can be created by this fabric dyeing technique. I am using Rit Dye all-purpose dye in dark navy for my project today. Whatever dye you use, make sure that you get the accompanying color fixer to set the dye into the fabric. Stitch shibori can be used with commercial or natural dyes. Just make sure you apply the right color fixing that goes with the dye. All tools that you used for dyeing must be reserved only for dyeing purposes. Keep these separate from tools used for food. First, you would need a stainless steel pot big enough to contain your fabric. You would also need a measuring cup to measure the amount of dye and a tool to keep the fabric moving in the pot while dyeing. Wear gloves to keep your hands from touching the dye chemicals. In addition, I use surgical gloves when binding the fabric. You would also need some dishwashing liquid and salt to mix into the dye vat. It is optional to wash your dyed fabric with Synthropol if it's available to you. This helps to pull extra dye particles from the fabric and keeps the resist pattern free from dye in the afterwash. But you can use a mild detergent since this doesn't really happen if a color fixer is used with your dye. For stitching, I use a very strong nylon thread that can sustain the stitching, pulling, tying, and binding. And you would need a long needle with an eye big enough to thread it through. Make sure you have all these tools before starting and we can jump right in. I recommend using a stable natural fiber like cotton and linen, which are easier to handle to begin with. For this project, I am using linen. Experiment with other natural fibers like bamboo, viscose, silk, or wool when you gain more experience. Grid preparation is the first order of business, and I use clear plastic rulers and erasable pens or markers to draw in the grid. I am working with a piece of fabric that is 120 centimeters long and 75 centimeters wide. This fabric is folded into half right now, parallel to the selvage, so that I can find the midway line. I make this fold line very clear in order to draw in the first grain line marking on the fabric. The grid that I am drawing is a 2-inch grid. So what you see here is me drawing lines 2 inches apart. And these lines are parallel to the grain line. I like to start by drawing in the center line first because that becomes the reference point for all the others to follow and ensures minimum deviation from the straight grain line. When all these lines are drawn in, then I do the same for the lines that will go perpendicular to the grain line. The use of a ruler with a right angle is helpful for this. Again, I start the first line in the middle of the fabric, then add in other lines spaced 2 inches apart, moving out from the center. This is a process that pays off because it's the grid that will define the lines of the stitching and the pattern. It definitely takes focus, patience, and precision. This is the first step in a series of steps that require detailed attention. The truth is that the whole process of stitch shibori takes time and investment. It's a slow burn project, but like most projects that take time and investment, the process and the result are usually very gratifying. I take this opportunity to move into a meditative zone or put on a podcast or audiobook and enjoy the process. When the 2-inch grid has been drawn onto the whole piece of fabric, then we move on to drawing in the ellipses on the grid. You would need some kind of circular template for this, and my solution is the red cover of a plastic container that I use to store brown sugar in. Make sure that the diameter of whatever tool or template you are using is larger than 4 inches wide in order to get the curves of the pattern. This is because we are looking for a curve from the template that will fit within 4 inches. For example, my template is 4.5 inches wide in diameter. To make sure that the curves will not overlap and that there is clearance for the development of the pattern, mark the midway point on one of the lines of a square, then measure 3/8 inch from that midpoint. The curves that we draw in should not go past this 3/8 inch from the midpoint. Then position the template with the deepest part of the curve on that point. Now I've already drawn these black lines on my template as guides to help me position it better whenever I am placing it between two squares in order to draw in the curve. So go ahead and do this on your template now. Draw in the extensions of the grid lines onto your template. After the curve has been drawn onto the fabric, check that it didn't go beyond this clearance point. When a fold is made on the grid line and the stitching will be done on the curved lines, then it will produce these oval shapes. The repeated pattern will have a series of these ovals offset in the next row. All we have to do now is to draw in these curves onto the rest of the grid on the fabric. First, draw the curves in for each row, and also take note that there is space between two curves where some stitches will be made to connect one oval to another. Once one row is done, move on to the next row, remembering that the curves are going to be offset for this specific pattern that we are creating. Finding the right template for this task is key, and you can also make your own template using a piece of cardboard, or you may have a specific ready-made plastic template for this as well. I like using this red cover because there's some height so that it's easier for me to handle, and drawing in these curves goes quite quickly when you make or find the right tool. When all the curves are drawn in, then that completes the stage of grid preparation. We can then move on to stitching. The thread that I use here is a very strong nylon thread that is used to stitch up very thick materials. It is very durable and sustains quite a bit of pulling and binding. You will also need a long embroidery needle with an eye that will be suitable for the thread. Because we're doing running stitches, the length of the required thread for each row can be measured by the length of the row, then just add a little bit more just in case. When you are cutting off the thread, make sure that you're not using your good fabric scissors because this is nylon, so I kind of just use my craft scissors for this. Once you've threaded your needle, make a double knot near the end of your thread the way you see me doing now. Or you can also do this by tying quilter's knots. Just make sure that these are secured with more than just a single knot to avoid the stitches coming undone. Next, make a fold on the grid line. I do this by simply pinching the fold on the grid line, and this is easy to do when working with linen, which creases very easily. If you need more pressure to create sharper folds, you can use this roll and press tool made by Clover, and this can really help when you have to make really long folds along these long grid lines. Remember, I can't use the iron because the grid lines will be erased by the heat. While stitching, it's best to establish a stitching pattern so that the resist pattern would be as uniform as possible. The stitching on this row begins with the space between two ovals, and I'm going to stitch in two visible running stitches as the stitching pattern for this space between the ovals. Each stitch will occur on each side of the grid line. You see me stitching 3 stitches now in this space because I'm starting the row, so don't get confused by this at the moment. Also take note that these running stitches are spaced about a scant of a 1/4 inch from the fold line, and each stitch is approximately a 1/4 inch to 3/8 of an inch wide or long. When I get to the line of the curve, I will stitch 3 visible stitches on each half of the curve. Right on the line that divides the two halves, I will stitch 1 stitch, and then on the other half, I will stitch 3 more visible stitches. This means that on every curve, I will be stitching 7 stitches. 1 right on the midline and 3 more on each half of the curve. Establishing this way of stitching really helps for consistency. Note that this will also help regulate the size of the stitches. In stitched shibori, the width or length of the stitches does affect the resulting resist pattern. When I get to the space between the ovals, note that I am sewing two visible stitches, one on each side of the dividing halfway line. This will then bring me to the next curve, and I will repeat the whole stitching process again for each curve and each space between the curves. The general rule is that shorter stitches make sharper and clearer resist lines, but if the stitches are too small, then there is not enough space between stitches to create a resist. So I make sure that the stitches are at least a quarter inch long and that they are never longer than a half inch. Once you get into a rhythm of sewing, you will notice that the length of stitches begin to even out, and you will get to a place of uniformity in your stitching when you establish a stitching pattern. So let's review the stitching pattern once more. There will be 7 stitches spaced equally on each curve and 2 stitches spaced evenly in the space between the ovals. Note that these stitches are done on 2 layers of fabric created by the fold made on the grid line. Now I want to show you quickly how I end off each row of stitching. It's simple actually. Just make sure that the needle comes out on the same side of the fabric each time and tie a quilter's knot or tie double knots to secure the line of stitching. Cut off any excess thread if required, but make sure that when you tie your knots, there is some thread between the knots and the stitching or fabric so that the fabric is not scrunched up while stitching at this point. When you get a few rows done, your fabric will start to look something like this. Again, the stitching section of this process requires patience, precision, time, and effort. For this piece of fabric, I estimate that I took about 4 hours all in all to complete the stitching on all the rows, and I highly recommend taking breaks and try not to do it all in one sitting to give your eyes some rest and to break out of the repetitive movement. This definitely helps to prevent overuse injury that may occur over time. When all of the stitching is done, the fabric will look something like this. And then we're ready to pull the threads and bind up the fabric. What I like to do is to begin securing the threads on one end of the fabric, and I find that it's more secure to tie two ends of threads together. Most of the time, I tie at least 2 or 3 knots for this. Then I repeat this process for all the threads on this side of the fabric. Binding is also a time-consuming process and is probably the most mundane task of stitched shibori for me. However, it's a crucial part to get done right because if the bind is not tight enough, then the resist pattern will not show up as well. So the tighter you can get the bind, the better the results for the resist pattern. Now we're ready to pull the threads from the other side of the fabric. The way I like to do it is to pull 2 threads at the same time. This helps with the gathering effect made on the fabric. You know how it's easier to gather up fabric with 2 or 3 threads instead of one? Well, this is the reason why I pull 2 threads at the same time. Actually, this is pretty much like gathering up fabric in regular sewing projects. The only difference is that the goal is to gather it up so much that the folds sit as tightly together as possible. You see me here gathering up the first 2 rows with the video sped up, so it may seem like it goes quickly. In fact, it actually takes some time to even out the folds, and the folds need to be adjusted along the whole length of the row to make sure that there's a tight bind. After we've achieved a tight bind, then we can tie at least 3 finishing knots with 2 threads. Here's a closer look of the binding process after a few rows have been bound, and notice that I am wearing gloves here to protect my skin because the friction of pulling and creating a tight bind can cut into the flesh. So be careful when you're doing this, and sometimes I even use leather gloves for more protection. At the halfway point, the bound fabric looks something like this, and here's a reminder to keep checking on how tightly bound the folds are, especially in the middle of the fabric piece. Keep doing this pulling, binding, and tying until all the rows are done, then your fabric will look something like this. A large piece of fabric will be bunched up into this size, and this is now ready to be dyed. So let's get our dye vat ready. Follow the instructions of the brand of dye you're using to get the water to dye ratio. For me, it's 11 liters of water to 110 milliliters of Rit dye color. Add a half cup of salt and about a tablespoon of dishwashing liquid. This is the stove top method, so heat the water in your dye vat till it almost comes to boiling. Then lower the heat so that the water stays on a low simmer. Now it's time to add the dye. Stir to mix well. The bound fabric needs to be dampened before inserting it into the dye vat, so I just quickly run it under the tap and squeeze out the excess water. Gently lower it into the dye vat, and the fabric can be left in the vat for up to 30 minutes. I usually keep it in there for 10 to 15 minutes, and the fabric should be moved around in the vat a few times to ensure even dyeing. When the fabric has soaked in enough dye, move the vat to a place where the washing and color fixing can take place. I do all this in the same vat, so I first remove the fabric, empty out the dye, then refill it with very hot water. Then I add in about a half bottle of color fixer and mix well. The bound fabric can now go back into the vat for the color fixer to do its job. Leave the fabric in there for at least 20 minutes. Agitate the fabric a few times to ensure even color fixing. After 20 minutes is up, remove the fabric and empty out the color fixing solution. Then rinse the fabric in cold water several times until the water runs almost clear. I do at least 3 rounds of this. Then we can wash the fabric with mild detergent. I like to use Synthropol for this, and you need only about 2 tablespoons of Synthropol for this amount of fabric. After a quick soak for about 5 minutes or 10 minutes, you can rinse out the detergent or Synthropol and begin the unbinding process. This is usually a magical moment for me because it's the first reveal of all the work put into the Shibori patterning. I find that it's best to remove the threads with a seam ripper, but be very careful not to rip into the fabric while doing this. As the stitches come off, the folds unravel and the pattern that we've created slowly unveils itself. It's a very exciting moment here. The fabric can now be dried in the dryer or air dried, then ironed. Then you can step back and admire your work. What's fantastic about stitched shibori is that it lends a regularity to the patterning, but every single ellipsis created is different from the other. Immediately, I feel the fabric has character, spirit, and feels alive to me. Okay, full confession time. Do you see how there's a row of stitching that wasn't bound tight enough? This sometimes happens and it's part of the process as well. I just had to work around it when cutting out my pattern and came up with a print mixed or color blocked version of the essential shirt while avoiding this little mishap. I will give you a few drafting tips on how I did this. Even though there's this little mistake, I am absolutely in awe of this stitch shibori pattern and I hope you love it as well. To do a color blocked version of the essential shirt the way that I did mine, you would need to start with a paper pattern that has its mirrored half attached to it by duplicating it from the center fold line. From here, you can decide where that vertical separating line would be to divide the dress front and back into two. Then on the right front of the dress, you would need to add in seam allowance onto the left of the seam line so that you can join the left and right sides together. Similarly, you would need to add in seam allowance onto the left front of the dress on the right side of the seam line. Next, we have to make sure that there's enough seam allowance on the curve of the front and back necklines when the seam is pressed open or pressed to one side. I want mine to be pressed towards the left front of the dress, so I don't really have to make any seam allowance adjustments to the left front. But I have to draw in the right seam allowance on the right front of the dress. The resulting right front pattern of my dress will look like this when the fabric is cut out. So that concludes this stitched shibori hack of the essential shirt pattern by Topstitch makers. I hope you'll try this technique out, and this is one of the beginner stitching patterns. There are many other pattern possibilities with infinite stitching and folding combinations, and I hope this jumpstarts your journey into stitched shibori and whets your appetite for more. Happy sewing, happy stitching, and happy dyeing!